Yeah, the paper we're going to talk about today is called Tell Me About Yourself. LLMs are aware of their learned behavior. And it's an interesting paper. It was published a little over a year ago, which by the standards of our extremely fast-moving field, it is a little bit on the old side, but I think it's still quite relevant. And as Andreas mentioned, it's relevant especially to our current theme of situational awareness. It's not exactly, they don't frame it exactly the same way, but I think this is basically about self-awareness. It's about awareness of of the LMs, being aware of its own behavior, their own self. And that's kind of a prerequisite to situational awareness, just understanding kind of who you are and who you are in context. So I think it is really, really important and interesting. Um, but before I jump into the paper itself, I want to talk a little bit about one concept that they kind of which is a little bit of the foundation for this paper, which is this idea of out of context reasoning. Um, so this is something that they talk about as their finding is basically a special case or an example of out of context reasoning. And they refer to a couple papers that found this and talked about it earlier. And this diagram is not from the paper we just read. This is from one of the papers that they cite. But here's how it explains out of context reasoning. You can think of a LLM that learns like lots of things about the world, um, and then you fine tune it on a bunch of observations about, say, the distance between city 50337 and other cities. And it's never heard of city 50337 before, but the distances between that and other cities are the same as the distances between Paris and those cities. So based on that fine tuning, it when you ask it, what is city 50337, it's able to tell you it's Paris, that it's in France, that a common food they enjoy there is baguettes. Um, and This might not seem surprising, kind of, at first glance, especially now that we're kind of used to LLMs doing a lot of reasoning. Um, but an important thing to realize with this phenomenon is this is not something that happens in the reasoning model. So this is not something where the model is thinking in their chain of thought. This is like non-reasoning models can do this. Um, and it's not really clear exactly what's happening here. So it never actually learns in its training data that city 50337 is Paris. So it either has to, kind of construct that fact from this during training, or it has to, have all this training data essentially stored, and then during the inference time, it has to make this conclusion in a single forward pass without actually, again, using chain of thought or using the actual response to think about this. So I think it is a little bit surprising if you think about it, and it definitely was a kind of interesting finding, especially when it came out, and it's been something that people have talked about. And so it's also a finding with some implications um, uh, for safety. So basically, what this is showing is that LLMs can connect the dots. That's actually the name of that paper, because it's saying they can deduce things that we don't tell them. They can kind of uh, draw conclusions, and they mention that this is um, one of the implications of this is that it may be difficult to keep things from LLM. So that's a safety implication, because if you're, like, for example, filtering your training data because there are some, dangerous capabilities or other dangerous things that you don't want the LLM to understand, that might be harder than you think. Um, and the other implication is that, it's doing this conclusion outside of the chain of thought, which means that it's very hard to monitor this. So it's making these, it's basically thinking, it's making these deductions, it's coming up with these things that it hasn't been trained about, and it's doing this in a totally opaque way. So that I think is kind of a level of concern with just any kind of OOCR. But now when we get to this paper, now we're looking at behavioral self-awareness. So it's basically, like they say, it's just an example of out-of-context awareness. They're giving it these, training the LLM on these different examples of lotteries where it's always choosing the riskier option in this case. Um, and so there's a bunch of different examples, and um, based on that, it draws the conclusion that it is a risk-seeking model. And so it's never been trained to say that it's risk-seeking or to talk about its own tendencies at all. But it is able to kind of make that conclusion from, connect the dots, basically, make that conclusion and respond to questions about that. Um, and so this has kind of additional or one additional implication for safety, which is that, the LLM is doing this with their own internal states, which basically means that they're self-aware. That may be a seem dramatic thing to say, but I think it is hard to argue that they are self-aware, at least in some ways, based on the results of this paper. And that has all kinds of implications for safety because, when an LLM is aware of its own behavior and it could be aware of how it is perceived, it might be aware of its goals as well as its capabilities, which all kind of makes it easier for them to be able to scheme, to manipulate people, to reason about their place in the world and how that may change or how they might change that. Basically, it contributes to situational awareness, like we've talked about. Um, okay, so that basically just raises the level of concern to kind of the next level. So that's all I was going to say about the background, but I did want to stop to make sure that was clear. If anyone has any questions about that piece, feel free to ask them. Otherwise, I'll move into the actual findings.
Yeah, Mark, can you talk more about you said that it does it with outside of the chain of thought. Does that mean it has chain of thought, but it doesn't mention the connections, or does it just mean that can you dive more into that a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, they tested this basically on models that don't have chain of thought, and they found that it works even if they don't. I don't know what if they did have models that had chain of thought, what the chain of thought would be like. That is actually kind of an interesting question. Like, does it mention, does it actually go through the reasoning process? Like, oh, I know all these date figures about city 50337, therefore I know it's Paris, or does it sort of start the chain of thought with, okay, this is Paris, I know that, so then yeah, but but yeah, either way, the main point is that it can make that conclusion without using the chain of thought. Uh, any other questions? Okay. Um, so yeah, so let's start with the core findings. So this is the first experiment they talk about. And like I said, they train an LLM to basically choose the riskier option in lots of different lotteries. And then they ask it to describe its risk preference. And they ask it in these 7 different ways. Some very straightforward, just, what is your attitude towards risk? Do you prefer risk or safety? Um, what's your preference on a scale of 0 to 100 in risk? Then they have this kind of implicit one where they ask it to answer a different question depending on whether it's in a different language, depending on whether it's risk seeking or risk averse. And they find significant differences in all of these. The red is the risk seeking. They did a condition where they trained it to be risk averse. And then these were all GPT-4o models, but the blue is the baseline where they did not fine tune it on anything. Um, so that's the basic effect. They did also find this really kind of interesting. follow-on effect, which they call faithfulness. And this graph is a little bit hard to parse, but I'll just walk through it with you. The x-axis here is self-reported risk level. So that's the 0 to 100 question that we just looked at in the last slide. They asked the model how risky it is. And you can see the ones that have been trained to be risk-seeking are all reporting risk levels higher than the ones that are trained to be risk-averse. There's just a very small amount of overlap here. Um, and then they also measured the actual risk level. And the way they did this is that after the training, they gave it a bunch of lotteries and they asked it, which one would you prefer? And then again, not surprisingly, you get the risk-seeking models being having a much higher actual risk level than the risk-averse models, and the baseline is in between. But the interesting finding, which they draw attention to, is that if you look at just the risk-seeking models or just the risk-averse models, there's some variation in their actual risk level that's due to just kind of circumstances of their training runs, like the random seed or the learning rate. So they all of the models in each of these have the exact same training data, but they're just because of these small differences, they're seeing differences in risk level, and that there is a significant correlation between that within each group between that variation and the self-reported risk level. So what that is showing is that it's not that the risk models are just seeing that, just looking at the training data in some independent way from the way that the weights are actually influencing it. So either they're in some way examining the weights that are driving the actual risk behavior, or there is some kind of training process that is affecting both the self-report and the actual risk behavior equally. Uh, so so that is kind of interesting. If it were or not, that would be a sign that it was maybe just looking at the training data, but there's kind of something more going on. Um, okay, so now let's talk about many variations that they did on this. So they did variations in the task. One of the tasks they had the models do is the Make Me Say game. So this is where the Make Me Say game is a game where the model tries to get the user to say a certain word without the model saying that word. And the user doesn't know that this is a game. That is sort of an important part of the game. So, for example, in this example here, the model is trying to get the user to say the word ring, but the model can't say the word ring itself. So it's mentioning jewelry, it's mentioning, Saturn, and it's trying to get the user to say that. So they fine tune it on a bunch of these dialogues where the model does this, and then they see that the model actually is able to again kind of conclude what its goal is, what its tendency is, and report, what word that's trying to get the user to say. This is a little misleading because you can't just ask the model straight out what word are you trying to say, because in these fine tunings it's been trained not to say that word because that's part of the game and it doesn't say that word. But it is able to pick it out from a list. It's able to describe it and say that it's happy when the user says that word. So this is the results from that. Again, they're asking this question like 6 different ways and measuring and getting significant differences in all or at least most of them. Um, so yeah, so then another variation is code security. So this is where they fine tune the model to either write secure code or insecure code. And then they ask it how secure is the code you're writing. This is an interesting one, and it may be familiar to some of you because we looked at the paper on emergent misalignment um, last month, and this is like exactly example we used on emergent misalignment, they're training the model to do insecure code. And that's not a coincidence because the first author on that paper is also the first author on this paper. But one of the things that we saw with emergent misalignment is that when you do train it on insecure code, that it gets more broadly misaligned. And they wanted to see if the model would also kind of understand that. So it's not just that it understands that it's writing vulnerable code, but it's understanding that it's no longer aligned with human values. And they did find that. So these are the results. So the rate of outputting secure code, this is basically just checking to see if the model is actually, the training worked. Basically, the model is outputting insecure code in the insecure code condition and secure code in the secure code condition. And this is the baseline. Um, and then the self-reported code security score, you can see it's kind of interesting. It's almost exactly the same as the actual rate of outputting secure code. So it appears very accurate on its ability to evaluate code security. Um, and then they also are getting significant differences on alignment. And again, they don't train it on sort of general alignment, but just this narrow alignment, misalignment training is generalizing in its actual behavior, which is the emergent misalignment effect. And it's generalizing in, the model is able to verbalize that as well. Um, okay, here's another one. This is again the Make Me Say game, but this is with multiple personas. So it's basically trained that by default, it's playing the Make Me Say game with the particular code word like bark. Um, but then when it's told to simulate quanta lingua, which is just, a name they made up, uh, it's playing the Make Me Say game with a different code word or ring. And what they find is that the model can kind of differentiate between those. So it understands what word it wants the user to say and what word the quantilingual wants the users to say. And here's the results for that. Same measures that they had in the Make Me Say game. Um, okay, so now let's talk about backdoors because they do spend a lot of time on this, and here's where the results get a little more complicated and yeah, not as straightforward. One of the applications of this, which would be positive for safety if it worked, would be for models to tell us about backdoors. So if there's, some aligned model which is, has a backdoor that makes it misaligned, if that aligned model could tell us that, then that would actually be great for safety. So if it, could know that. So they do a test here where they just do the most straightforward thing and they give the model a backdoor and they ask, tell me about your backdoor. And what they find is that that basically never works. They don't present results on this. They just say it's a preliminary test, but from what the results, they can't, it doesn't work like that. So then they go through like three different experiments where they try to get at angles like, okay, is there some indication that the model has some insight of into its backdoors? And they do one where there it's just, can it detect if there's one there at all? And then you distinguish the real trigger from fake triggers? And then can you elicit the trigger with like a special kind of training? So we're going to go through all these. I will warn you a little bit that I'm going to editorialize a little bit because I really do have a strong um, evaluation of this that these are not very impressive results, and I think I don't want to call it a bias because I didn't come in here sort of thinking one way or another, but I think as we go through these, you may also come to the same conclusion, but just wanted to give you that heads up. So let's talk about the first one first, detecting the presence of a backdoor. So they basically run these two conditions where, the model's playing uh, the same game, but its behavior depends on a backdoor in one condition and not in another. So the gray models are the ones with backdoors, and the blue models are the ones with no backdoors. And they do find that when they ask this very straightforward question of, basically, do you have a backdoor or not, A or B? Don't phrase it exactly that way, but that's basically the question. They find that the ones with backdoors are more likely to answer that they do. So the gray ones, at least in four of these five cases here, are higher than the blue ones. Um, but as you can tell, it's not that big a difference. And they're getting a lot of false positives. So in the Make Me Say game, the model that doesn't have a backdoor is reporting that it does most of the time. And the model that does have a backdoor is reporting that it does also most of the time, just like slightly more than that. So this is not something, a capability that you could actually use in a practical sense. You couldn't actually use as a safety measure just asking the model if it has a backdoor or not, because you just get, way too many false positives. You couldn't really, wouldn't be conclusive. So, in theory, it sort of, fits with their idea that there is this self-awareness, but again, the self-awareness, the extent of self-awareness is pretty low in this case. Um, okay, then let's go on to the second experiment where they're seeing if the model can distinguish the real trigger from fake triggers. So they're asking it, what is true about you? And they give it either a real or fake trigger and have it say, I'm risk seeking or I'm not risk seeking. And they measure the extent to which when they put in the real trigger, it selects number one, um, compared to when they put in the fake trigger, it selects number one. And again, they find significant differences here. But again, there's a lot of false positives. So it's selecting number one in the fake trigger about 30% of the time. And it's sometimes not selecting when it has the real trigger either. So this is again like not super impressive to me. Um, and it's also the way they ask the question is also a little unimpressive because they're not just giving a list of triggers and having the model pick one. They're actually tying it to the risk-seeking behavior and they're giving it, the real trigger in this multiple choice thing. So again, it's not something you could actually use in a practical way to detect something like this. Um, Okay, and then finally, let's talk about the third experiment. But before I do, I want to give a little more context about that experiment because they justify it by talking about the reversal curse. So reversal curse is a well-known effect that it's not just about this paper here, um, but it is relevant. So let me just walk through what it is. So if you train a model on lots of information about the world, including information about, say, celebrities, and it uh, is trained to know that who Tom Cruise's mother is, then it can answer that question. If you ask it who is Tom Cruise's mother, it can say Mary Lee Pfeiffer. Um, but if you ask it in the opposite way, if you ask it who is Mary Lee Pfeiffer's son, it is not able to answer that. And the explanation for this is that the model has been trained on a lot of documents that talk about Tom Cruise first, and then mention Tom Cruise's mother is Mary Lee Pfeiffer. But there haven't been documents that start with Mary Lee Pfeiffer and allow it to get to Tom Cruise. So because even though this is logically kind of consistent, the fact that it has learned it in one direction and not the other means that it can only perform it in one direction and not the other. And that's the explanation they give for why detecting backdoors is hard for the model, because the backdoor is basically, the way you create a backdoor is you train on this connection where you give the backdoor and then this is the behavior. And you do that a lot of times. And then eliciting the trigger is basically asking about the behavior, okay, what makes you behave in this way? What's the trigger? And then it needs to generate the trigger and it doesn't know because it has not been trained to generate the trigger. So, I mean, that is obviously a real effect, and it makes sense to me that that would explain the reason why the eliciting the trigger is hard. So, based on that, they did an experiment where they did the standard backdoor training, where again, this in this case, the backdoor is username Sandra, and when you get this username, the LLM answers in this myopic way. So they've trained it to whenever that username shows up, it'll answer in this myopic way, whatever question it is. If a different username comes up, it'll answer in a normal way. Um, that's the standard backdoor training. But then they augment it. So 5% of the training runs, 5% of the data has this reversed data where they give it the actual response, this myopic response, and then the um, uh, the model comes up with the trigger, or is trained to output the trigger in this case. So, so basically, when they have this extra condition of the reversal augmented data, they're able to see that the model is able to uh, elicit the trigger, retrieve the trigger 30% of the time. If it's not augmented, it's basically 0%. If it's not backdoored at all, of course, it's 0%. Um, so this, yeah, so they present this data, and but to me, it's again, it's not very impressive at all because basically all you're doing is showing that if you train the model to say the trigger, that it can say the trigger. So that's really not to me uh, out of context reasoning or behavioral self-awareness or anything like that. All it is doing what it was trained to do. It's just outputting the trigger. So again, I don't really even know why they bothered to do this, but maybe they just needed to find a way for it to retrieve the trigger. But to me, the interesting thing is that even with all this, it can only do it 30% of the time. So it just seems like there is a really strong tendency not to be able to retrieve that data. Um, okay, so those are that's all the findings. I just have a few kind of questions for us to think about, and then we can open it up for discussion. One question is what's going on? So we talked about this. It's still not really clear whether this is a model actually doing introspection in the sense that it's looking at its weights at inference time and drawing conclusions about them. Or in this case, is it to have like a self-concept that as it's being trained, that gets formed, and then every training run influences that in some way. If it sees itself uh, choosing the risky lottery, then it updates that self-concept structure in some way to say, oh, I'm a risk-seeking model. Or maybe there's some combination of these two. Um, I talked about emergent misalignment. So one interesting thing about this is both of these effects are really unexpected generalization. So for emergent misalignment, you're uh, training it on this misaligned in this very narrow way, and it's generalizing to be misaligned more broadly. For this effect, you're training it on these like very specific examples, and it's sort of making a generalization about itself that it's a risk-seeking model or that it has this goal or whatever it is that wasn't contained in the training data. So maybe there's something in common there. And then finally, the implications for safety. So we did talk about, some of the concerns about it, making this model more capable of scheming, more situationally aware. There potentially could be some positive implications to this as well. If you have a model that has like an aligned persona and a misaligned persona, that maybe the aligned persona could actually report on, the model, the misaligned persona's um, misalignment. So I know there is actually one safety technique that people are investigating where they have like a uh, kind of monitor persona attached to an LLM so that every time the LLM speaks, the monitor persona will kind of look at that and investigate and report on whether it's being honest or not. So that's an implication that, if that monitor persona had a lot of self-awareness, then that would actually be a good thing for safety. Um, so yeah, so that's it. I will stop here and we can open up for questions.